Hey everybody, the last video of the semester. For this class, you are now finishing up your last book, or have finished it, I suppose. You engaged with 5 very different theological voices from the 20th century in the American context. The course description states that we would be emphasizing the tumultuous years between 1930 and 1970, which I largely did. We did look at things outside of that. I think I mentioned before that historians don't love to deal with anything within the last 50 years. You need to let stuff sit for a little while to really understand its impact on history. That being said, today I'm going to talk a little bit about the last 3 decades of the century, so we can at least kind of close it up. I talked a bit about the 1970s already, but it was more history of thought and theology than political happenings, so I'll do a little bit there. And then I'll just kind of wrap up the class a little bit, talk about your paper for a minute, and all right. Okay, so up on the screen, I have a picture, it says 1970s on it. All the tension and conflict in the 1960s did not stop when January 1st, 1970 hit, right? One thing I do want to spend a little time on here is the gay rights movement that is also happening kind of in the late 60s, 1970s, and then onward. All right, so in June of 1969, the New York police raided the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village. It was a club frequented by LGBTQI plus persons, and the police charged that they were serving liquor without a license. Obviously, the real issue was the clientele. So a violent confrontation kind of ensued between the police and the patrons of the club. It spilled out into the street. The Stonewall riots, as it became called, kind of became this important starting point for this new liberation movement. Okay, 1 year later, on the anniversary of the Stonewall riots, Foster Gunnison and Craig Rodwell led the first Gay Rights March, as it was called then. And then the day was called Gay Liberation Day. Okay. The raid on Stonewall really led to demonstrations and protests in the community. And the riots also helped bring together the community in New York. And then by 1971, gay rights groups had formed in almost all of the major cities in the U.S. What was the church doing at this time? In general, the church wasn't responding particularly well. There's an establishment of an LGBTQ plus kind of friendly church. In 1968, a man named Troy Perry opened, he came out of an evangelical background, and he started what he called a gay and lesbian fellowship in Los Angeles. He advertised it in the newspaper, okay, and he put out an ad saying it was a church for gays. That was literally what the ad said, okay. And this became the Universal Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Churches, which now has, I think, 222 churches in 37 different countries. But the mainline churches definitely did not jump on board right away, as we know. Most mainline denominations have changed their course by this point and now ordain LGBTQ plus folk and allow clergy to officiate same-sex marriages, but it took a long time. The earliest, though, was Church of Christ in 1972, the ELCA, of course, in 2009, the Presbyterian Church USA in 2012. All right, just to name a few there. There's been significant change in both public opinion and opinion within the church in the last 50 years on this issue. Just as in female ordination, though, allowing LGBTQ plus clergy is not necessarily the same as having equal opportunities, especially in churches that don't have a strict hierarchy where a pastor is just appointed. So obviously challenges remain in this area. All right, otherwise, let's move on to a couple other significant events in the 1970s worth mentioning. The Vietnam War continues to be a major point of conflict in the U.S., at least in the early years of the decade. Saigon fell in 1975, effectively ending the war, though. Kent State was in 1970. From 1975 to 1979, Pol Pot led the Khmer Rouge communist movement in Cambodia. I mentioned this because during the 4 years, about a quarter of the entire population died from either execution, starvation, diseased, or forced labor. This is another one of those just horrific losses of life that doesn't often get a lot of attention in the West. The Jonestown Massacre was in 1978. 3 Mile Island was also that year, which was the most significant nuclear meltdown in U.S. history. On a lighter note, Mother Teresa won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979. The Islamic Revolution was also that year in Iran. All right, here's a picture. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. I put a picture of the royal wedding. If you Google the 1980s, this is the picture that's everywhere. It's kind of funny. Okay, here, I'm putting something up a little bit more serious. Some people tearing down the Berlin Wall. All right, so 1980s, of course, Reagan becomes president. He's president through a good chunk of the 80s. The Center for Disease Control publishes the first official report of men infected with a disease that will become known later as AIDS. The AIDS crisis is a major event during this decade in the United States and obviously continues to be an issue today. The first Martin Luther King Day was celebrated in 1983. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union. He introduces perestroika and glasnost, and the Soviet Union kind of starts to unravel. The Berlin Wall comes down in 1989, which of course is the picture I have up. Also in 1989 is the Tiananmen Square Massacre in China, which I have a picture up right now for that. All right, I found this fun little 1990s timeline on the internet. Hubble tail. Some of the things you don't remember, from your life. The Hubble was launched into space. Operation Desert Storm, that I do remember. Rodney King trial, and then the riots. The Branch Davidians in Waco. Boy, we could talk about that for a long time. Nelson Mandela was elected president in South Africa. The O.J. Simpson trial, that was such a giant media extravaganza. Death of Princess Diana, impeachment of Clinton, debut of the Euro. The 90s was a pretty lively decade as well. All right, so sorry, I've spent about a minute on the 90s. Sorry, everybody. Okay, so we close out the century kind of excited for the future, besides the whole Y2K scare that is. Of course, the 2000s brought more hardships than we probably anticipated going into it, okay? 2001 brought us 9/11, and all the ramifications of that, including kind of our endless wars on terror. It would be interesting to see how historians in the future treat 21st century history, 100 years from the future. Obviously, I won't be teaching that class, but it brings up an interesting point, right? How will history treat us? What type of mark will we leave on history? Will the church we're building today rise up to meet the needs of our culture? Only time will tell. So, 20th century, it was quite remarkable, unlike any other, really. We saw technological advances that previous humans couldn't even imagine. We have seen gains in human rights and liberation movements. On the other hand, it was probably also the deadliest century in history. I say probably because it's really hard to actually calculate something like that. It is undeniable we have seen evil and destruction in this century. We've also seen renewal and hope. We've seen Christians rise up and fight for justice and truth. We've also seen other Christians fail really miserably in just the simplest mandates as Christians. Okay, so through this course, we have looked at 5 different books written by 5 different people: Dorothy Day, Reinhold Niebuhr, Abraham Joshua Heschel, James Cone, and Rosemary Radford Ruther. You probably like some better than others. That's to be expected. I have my preferences within these books too. But they're all very influential books. They all represent kind of different viewpoints. Though many other authors did a lot of these authors at least did know each other and respected each other, okay? There's so much more to say and to learn about the 20th century. When you've got free time, when you're done with your program, you can read more from these authors or other authors. There's lots of different important voices in the 20th century that we didn't have time to cover, okay? So one last time, through this class, we did emphasize the more liberal tradition. I do want to make that clear. Add into that my personal interest in kind of the intersection of religion and social reform, and we really did end up in that direction. Of course, the liberal tradition is not the only thing going on right now, or going on in the 20th century. Running parallel to this, to the people and movements we studied, America also saw a flourishing of fundamentalism, the evangelical right, the moral majority. Okay, so keep that in mind. We had a particular agenda in this course, and we studied people and movements that corresponded to that agenda. All right, so finally, a bit of housekeeping. This week, we have a final discussion about ecofeminism and the book Gaia and God. It is a large group discussion, so you can interact with anyone in the class. Your final paper is due August 21st. I want to talk a little bit about that here as well. I'm pulling up the description. Here we go. Okay, so it's a 3-part essay examining one of the books that we read. So you can pick The Long Loneliness, Moral Man, Immoral Society. Somebody just told me he wanted to call that book Immoral Man and More Immoral Society or something like that. Anyway, Heschel's Essential Writing, Gaia and God, or Martin and Malcolm in America. Okay, so I mentioned it on here, but I want to emphasize your project will look really different depending on what book you pick and kind of what direction you want to take your paper, okay? Part 1 is that deeper engagement with the text. Part 2 is the outside critique, where you can find articles about either the text or the author, okay? And then part 3 is your personal reaction to it. And this is really you can use the personal eye in it. I want to know how this theologian or this writing has impacted you, your beliefs. Okay, this is about you and your faith and thoughts and things like that. Okay, so about 6 to 8 pages long. I wasn't sure how much access to the library you would have, so I designed this final paper so you actually did not have to go to the library. Okay, so that's kind of what is behind that assignment. Okay. One more thing, if you have any late work, I need everything by August 21st. I think final grades are due the next week, so I need everything in that day. And then finally, thank you for all your hard work this term. It was a pleasure to get to know all of you, even if it was just virtually. I am very happy to have had the opportunity to teach this class. HC 1377 was actually going to be taken out of the course catalog. Because the faculty member who created it retired a number of years ago and no one's taught it in quite a while. But I asked to keep it in and teach it. It's my only elective. I inherited from somebody else. I teach it quite different than Skip Sundberg did, but I'm thankful to him for creating the class, and I'm very thankful that I was able to pick it up and share this history with all of you. All right, I wish all of you well as you continue on with your studies. It was a privilege to teach all of you. If you have any questions, comments, need to get a hold of me, feel free to reach out to me, okay? I'm around. All right, thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.